Hey everybody, I am doing the weekly wrap-up on MangoLassi. It is Sunday, May, I don't even know, 20th, and we're going to go through and just see what we've got out there. So, starting at, so I'm just going to do 1 to 13 posts and more, because it's kind of the cutoff for this week. So, a full week ago, from me, Docker for production use of third-party software. I think this is a good discussion, but of course I started it, so, you know, take that with a grain of salt. But jump in there, have some thoughts. I want to see more people discussing this, but basically, so there had been another discussion about Docker. Is Docker really a smart way to do some things? And I wanted to write up exactly why I felt Docker was bad for the majority use case in IT, but kind of, you know, put in those caveats or those filters of for these use cases, right? Bespoke software, it can be great. Testing, it can be great. I don't like it for testing. I have some thoughts there, but they're far less important. But using Docker for third-party software can cause a lot of problems. A lot of people seem to agree. There's definitely some people who do use it for that, and some that think that because third parties... One of the things that this came from is there are third parties who push Docker as a way to deploy their software, and a lot of good discussion around operational mindset, I think, goes into that as well, and that's really where that played in. Next up, replacing a VGA projector in the main conference room from Magic Marker. I don't think I was involved in that one, but you can imagine where the discussion went, mostly around what you can do instead of a VGA projector in a conference room. Next up, changes at Sangoma. Sangoma recently purchased Digium, I believe, and obviously there's been, or not, obviously there was likely to be, there's been some shakeup in the personnel there, and that came up a bit. PS with experience with Rackspace email. Pretty much that one was what people would expect. Lots of people had used it. It was fine in the past. No one likes it now. Moving on. IRJ, is Telegram down for everyone? Yeah, just a status thread. And yes, it was. Let's see, WRX7M, video conferencing hardware suggestions. This one's still going on a little bit, and I have some more input probably coming up in the next week, but a lot of people pretty much going with some Logitech stuff. Everyone... it's tough to find good hardware, right? Especially that works with flexible environments. So I think Logitech tends to be the winner there, but check out the thread. IRJ, again, massive speed increase when switching WordPress from Apache to Nginx. Good thread, I really like that one. A lot of research that you don't normally see in these kinds of things, so very, very interesting. IRJ did a follow-up that I don't think was popular enough to hit this list, but did some documentation on exactly what he had done and how you could run Nginx in the way that he did yourself. So good discussion there. Obsolescence with mouse pointer periodically freeze in place. That one's just troubleshooting. As Dave 24/7 domain controller DNS settings order best practice. I like this one, and this one comes up every so often, so it's a recurring one because we're pretty much all convinced that we know what the right answer is here, and everyone can point to a Microsoft reference as to what the best practice is. It turns out that everyone can point to a different Microsoft reference. They conflict with each other. People conflict with each other, and when we break it down, the answer is it doesn't really matter. It just doesn't. Next up, setting up a SkyTel SIP trunk in FreePBX. Jared Bush. This is a how-to, so not too much to say. SkyTel has been a topic a bit recently, so a lot of people checking them out. And obviously, FreePBX, always popular in the community, so a lot of people using that as well. Windows 10 startup from WR Combs. This one was a troubleshooting one about things happening when Windows 10 started up. It's been idle for almost a week. I think it's been resolved, but if not, someone jump in there. WireStyle22. How do I block anything after .com that is not a country code with a regular expression for email filtering purposes? That one was really about spam filtering, and got a little bit of complexity just because it was not worded for what he was actually looking for. So most of the discussion is really trying to figure out what he wanted rather than to fix the problem that he's looking for. But, you know, some discussion about ways that you might be able to block some spam, but also in ways that might block lots of legitimate stuff, so worth reading. Dash Render, passing OpenVPN through ERX. Pretty much what it sounds like, how to get OpenVPN through from one end to the other so that you can use a VPN device somewhere inside your network. NDC with Proposal. That one was Nate asking about proposals for doing third-party support, basically MSP, and talking about taxes and incorporation and insurance and that kind of stuff for side work, I believe. And his tag is consulting, freelance. Should I do it? VPN file transfer problems from Not Very Punny. Quite a few posts on that, and I believe it has been resolved. There were performance issues. I do not know what the answer was, probably because I just don't remember, but that one is marked as solved. So, Ubuntu 19.04 upgraded from 18.10, Mesh Central not redirecting port 80. That one had quite a bit of troubleshooting in it. Got off on a tangent a little bit, but bottom line was not running as root and trying to use a root privileged port. So for anyone who isn't sure what that means, check that out, because that's a good thing to be looking for. Being aware that you need root privileges to use any port under 1024 is very important when doing port troubleshooting. It's one of those things that, like, who really needs to know that? It's just one of those obscure little details. No, it's actually something that comes up in real life that when you're running, especially Unix systems, quite often we'll put into configuration. Configuration doesn't work. Where does it log that? Heaven only knows. But it's the thing causing you production problems. So, good to know. Next up, MailCow in production data center. This one is from me, had quite a bit of post, and I'm going to open it and see what it was, because I know what the general topic is, but I don't remember exactly where the discussion went. Pretty much, asking people who have MailCow, because there's been a bit of discussion about that recently, in production, how are you setting it up? Because it doesn't work as well as you'd hope, putting it behind a proxy. And there was a bit of discussion, and this is what led to the Docker discussions, or this came off of the Docker and production discussions, because MailCow now pushes Docker as their only official way to run in production, and their Docker system is not set up for what we would normally expect someone to run for production. It should work fine in a cloud kind of environment, but in your own data center, it's probably going to run into issues. So I need to circle back on that and deploy that again so we can test. So, have not forgotten, people, just busy. What would you do? Pete S. And he was asking about the topic of course it always scrolls to the bottom, how to handle a customer situation. So actually I'm going to read this one because it's a good discussion with a bit of stuff. A customer asks you for a solution to a problem. You have knowledge about the customer systems because they're a repeat customer. You present a solution and give them a quote. The customer decides to go with another company instead. After some time, the customer comes back and asks if you can offer some pointers to get the guys from the other company going forward with the implementation. What are the options? What would you do? That was word for word. And I think that was a good discussion overall because it really digs into the business of being a consultancy, whether you're an ITSP, MSP, whatever, and how you approach customers and deal with the emotional problems that come of when we give a bid, especially to an existing customer, and we're trying to do a good job, and then they go with someone who's going to charge less and then doesn't bother doing the work. Obviously, they gave them that bid because they were charging too little. So it emotionally hurts. It's very hard for us, especially on the business end, to know how to react appropriately to situations like that because we feel offended, right? Why would you? Obviously, I was trying to give you a good deal. That guy obviously was trying to screw you. Why did you do the bid process? There you go, right? It leads to animosity, and knowing how to respond to that correctly is important. So good discussion with 64 posts. Go check that out. At 69 posts, folder sharing issue. This is another one from WR Combs, technical problem, and they did get it figured out in the end. And honestly, I don't know what the issue was or what the solution was. It's probably... we're going to read the solution. Have since tried to uninstall the NIC and make registry changes, but no luck. Edit. Upon this and changing registry keys, I was able to get it to communicate properly. Not a lot of details, but that's what he did. And at number 1, this one's still going on, currently at 90 posts, and it only just started 5 hours ago. Revisiting ZFS and FreeNAS in 2019. This one's a pretty heated discussion that Jared kicked off when he posted something that Rob Thomas, formerly of FreePBX, had said... where he basically said previously he was wrong, FreeNAS is amazing, and goes on to rave about FreeNAS and ZFS. Jared kind of pokes the bear and points out that FreeNAS has long been considered a pretty bad product to be deploying in production, which leads to me posting the well-documented information that we've been doing for years. This goes back to a Cult of ZFS article that's half a decade old. The Jurassic Park effect, that's 4 years old. I did some research, and some of these threads on these problems go back like 6-7 years or more. And some of the stuff that became the underpinnings of the Cult of ZFS article goes back to at least 2011. So we're looking at almost a decade of this being established. These products are problematic. The way that people are approaching them, their communities are bad. And we have also on MangoLassi the Common Myths post, right? Common Myths we hear from the FreeNAS community. That one is from early 2018. So I'm actually surprised that it's that recent, and it may be a copy taken from somewhere else. I'm not sure if that's actually the original or not, but that is well documented because the same things kept coming up, the same myths that are well refuted, that should not even come onto the radar as something you could ever try to spread, are listed out. Things that have been dead horse topics, right? These are beyond refute. And Rob decided to come in and basically try to say that all of those myths were actually true. And that went on for 90 posts. And that I'm actually going to make another video about, maybe, I don't know. But it's worth reading through, right? It's 90 posts. It's worth going through it because it shows the dangers of hubris. It shows how, I've recommended this a lot in the past, people need to go read Predictably Irrational. It's good to learn about your own fight or flight response. It's really good to learn about how humans will very commonly have a memory or something like that. And in this case, he said that it was bad notes from the class he took. And those notes led him to bad information, if that's really the source. And then using that bad information, he concocted an entire framework of irrational and completely nonsense stuff around what RAID was and what ZFS was. I mean, like really wild stuff, right? Things like RAID means parity, ZFS is not RAID, like really fundamental stuff, just crazy things that that make no sense. But these are kind of things that are talked about in Predictably Irrational, because what happens is humans assume that we are rational creatures, but we are not. We're completely irrational, almost completely irrational. We're very emotional, and our memories are faulty. And so it's really easy to have a faulty memory and say, well, I believe this thing to be true, and then you say it. Once you say it, especially in text, right? So he made some statements that were kind of hard to defend. And in a rational response, it would have been, oh, maybe I made a bad point. Let's discuss, right? And you have a back and forth. But it's not how humans work, and this has nothing to do with Rob in particular. And it turned into what Predictably Irrational talks about. It's called reverse rationalization. And we have this memory and we say, well, I remember this thing, so I must have arrived at this belief rationally. So what things would have made this rational? And you start working from a false pretense, right? And you start trying to find rational things that would make it true. And you start believing that those things are true. And as you believe those things are true, other things must be true because of them. And in this case, it became a long string of reverse rationalization based on a fundamentally flawed pretense, which was that ZFS was not RAID and did not do parity. So because he believed that it was not RAID and did not do parity, he then assumed that because of those things, ZFS was special and did these other things based on not having those limitations. And then more things were based on those things. Of course, as we all know, ZFS is RAID. It is not like RAID. It's not sort of RAID. It's not a replacement for RAID. It is RAID, right? And it's primarily used for parity. Its claim to fame is that it has more parity options than any other RAID implementation ever made. That is its claim to fame. Its non-parity RAID implementation options are nothing special, right? It's only special because of its parity within the RAID context. And so, and the basics, like what RAID is, was fundamentally wrong. And so it started with not knowing what RAID was, then not knowing what ZFS was, and then trying to defend one thing based on it being different than the other So if you can imagine not knowing A and not knowing B and defending C based on believing that A and B were opposites, when in fact the thing you thought was A is not true and the thing you thought was B is not true, and the fact that they're opposites was not true, every piece of the discussion was based on a false underpinning. And so it just became this unbelievable discussion. And it's good from a technical standpoint because there's a lot of digging into taking the common myths and saying, why would someone believe these things, right? But it starts from someone believes ZFS is magic and is really amazing. Not that it's not great, right? People get this impression that I'm somehow putting down ZFS. And then working backwards and saying, well, it must be magic and it must be great because I think it is. So rationally, why do I believe that's true? Well, I must have had proof. And so what kind of proof would I have? And just see how that happens. And then seeing how even after finding out and being able to express that that there was no underpinnings for all the fundamentals, like just no concept of what these products were, how they work, whatever, then trying to defend that he's a domain expert, and saying, at first it was, I am your guest ZFS expert, ask me anything, and then ranting about how he's a specialist in this area, and just, it goes on and on. It's pretty amazing where it goes, and that he's not realizing that everybody he's talking to, and he's not looking around the community to see that basically everyone in the community has so much more experience than he does. It's just, it's a bizarre thread, but it really helps to explain why so many people got these myths into their heads, and why they defend them, and why they keep getting repeated, even after years of them being just dead horse items, and how someone who doesn't even have a passing knowledge like this, you couldn't have a bar conversation about storage without it coming out that obviously not familiar with RAID and isn't sure what it is, and having not even a CompTIA A+ level knowledge of this, right? Like, but not realizing that everyone else is like, what? Like, this is not realizing this is common knowledge that everyone else knows, and thinking that it's really complex and something hard that he's trying to explain. And at no point even figures out, forgets that he didn't know what things were, had names of products completely wrong, never figured out that he had the names wrong, had Z-RAID 8 as a thing, went on and on about Z-RAID 8 as if there's any RAID with an 8 in it. And if there's any RAID called Z-RAID, none of these things exist. None of them are logical continuations of something else, but lacking the fundamentals, it's amazing how much you can skew once you've convinced yourself that you know something. And then the amazing revelation that the basis for being an expert on something was he once took a class on it, which is normally the opposite of what makes you an expert, right? Normally, you take a class because you're not very knowledgeable of it, and then he went back and figured out that the class had taught wrong information and didn't know the basics, so it wasn't really a class on RAID. So he's never actually had a class on RAID, apparently, just based on the things that he said, but in the end was literally, all caps about how he was the expert in the field, even after 90 posts where he had even admitted he wasn't clear what RAID or ZFS was. He then believed that even though all of the foundation of the things that he had said were wrong, and that not just he was standing by his conclusions, even though he had no continuing basis for them. And so from a technical standpoint, yeah, it's interesting. But from an emotional standpoint, and seeing it as the progression of a professional, and reading the post, it very much feels like you're reading, a high school student, right? But a high school student who's convinced that they know what they're doing, right? It's weird, but just reading it, hearing the tone in the voice, and the I'm an expert, I took a class, oh my notes were wrong, the dangers of trying to memorize facts about, in this case, RAID, instead of actually learning how it works. Any amount of learning how it works would have immediately exposed, well, obviously I had things wrong because the thing I thought ZFS was conflicts with what RAID is, so clearly that doesn't match up, I have to go look it up, right? Any amount of knowing ZFS or RAID any amount would have immediately exposed that all the knowledge was wrong, and you would have realized. But having none, because it was all memorized, presumably, rather than understood, allowed really, really wild things about all of them to be stated, and then just, this continuation. So, looking at it from a how do humans react to being called out, to being discovered, to realizing that they are in over their head, or trying to hide it from themselves, what we consider to be experts, right? This was, pretty unbelievable that even at the end was working very hard to try to throw misdirection in. Some of that pretty skilled, throwing in things about performance, which, people know if you talk about performance, no matter how unimportant performance is, if you mention it, it's going to make people go, oh, performance, that's important. Nobody says performance isn't important, but the reality is most of the time it's not. Things like that were being done skillfully while at the same time posting very poorly and not being able to maintain the conversation, and not being able to look like someone who plausibly knew what any of the things that were being discussed were. So I think it's great from a professional development standpoint to read the thread and really understand where it goes. And then, of course, the technical details, but they're all things that everyone knows already, right? This is so basic that it's amazing anyone would have carried on the conversation. It was literally, it seemed like you were talking to a high schooler who had not taken the A+ class yet, or had taken it but tried to memorize those pieces in a brain dump, and the answer wasn't C, so they weren't sure what to do. That's really what it seemed like. It seemed like someone who had memorized answer C, B, A, D, C on a thing about RAID, and then when we started discussing it, the things didn't line up with the letters, and they started picking answers out of the letters, and obviously they don't make any sense because it was completely random and gibberish. Anyway, that is our week. That is a good read. That one is still going. Obsolescence. He doesn't care. That's not his real name. Just upvoted some of the stuff in there while I'm posting. So, yay! Get in there, post some more, have some great discussions. I will see everybody later this week.